Anyway, so the Scottish Union for Education set up a year ago. The strapline, as Richard said, is education, not indoctrination. We are concerned about standards in education falling and indoctrination, as the name suggests. So I'm basically going to I'll give you a little thesis, which is very broad and abstract about what I think the wide problem is. And then I'm going to tell you about my personal problems, which is the exciting bit. And then I'll look a little bit more at what I think the ethos in education is at the minute, in terms of the problematic ethos that's in education. How long do you want me to talk for, would you say? 40 minutes now, right? Okay, that's what I've got. I'll go for that. Okay, so my starting point thesis is that at a kind of broad historical level, that at the minute society finds it very difficult to engage with the idea of human history in a positive way, right? So struggles with the idea of the Enlightenment as something that was enlightening, and struggles with the idea of human progress. So we have a much greater sentiment of regression and problems and misanthropy in terms of seeing humanity in a negative way rather than a positive way. And I think you can look back, you can actually see this emerging already in the 19th century with the progressive movement in education. Not to say that everything about it was necessarily wrong, but you already started to see a questioning of the usefulness of passing on the human knowledge of the past to the next generation, right? Which is what I think education should essentially be. And because of that, I think education became confused and has become increasingly confused over the century. And in the last few decades, it's off the charts in terms of the confusion now about what education is. To put it kind of crudely, I suppose, if you have a sense of, or if you lose a sense of human progress and the possibilities of human progress, or the idea that there is something, enlightening and that we can advance and improve and develop. If you lose that sentiment, which I think we have, then the past increasingly becomes sullied in the imagination and in the imagination of educationalists. So if that's true, this idea that education should be about the best that's ever been thought and said starts to become sullied as well. Right? Because it's from the past, it's past knowledge, it's from these old bigots, these white men and so on. Right? I mean, that's only just one dimension of it, but it has that quality to it. And so, this idea of you stand on the shoulders of giants, that's what each generation should do. We should be able to pass them on this incredible body of knowledge. They should be able to stand on that and look into the future and build upon it. That's what I think education at a kind of broad level should be. But as I say, what if we start to see all these giants as bigots? Right? And I'm putting it crudely because it's much more complex than that. But in the modern context, I think you can see that quite easily. So I don't know, I'm assuming most people are from Edinburgh, and I assume you know about the David Hume Tower at Edinburgh University. So David Hume, Enlightenment, probably Scotland's top two Enlightenment philosopher of the 18th century, and students didn't like that. There's 2 footnotes in David Hume's whole body of work where he describes Negroes as inferior. And on the back of that, they campaigned, and Edinburgh University folded and got rid of the name of David Hume, right? Which is quite extraordinary, I think. Not that surprising in the context of the mad world we live in, but pretty extraordinary. And I went to a talk in Dundee where Jeff Palmer was the first black professor in Scotland. He now has taken on a kind of Nelson Mandela role in Scotland of a kind of anti-racist guru. and he was in Dundee, and he was describing what a problem Hume was, and he said, which shows the kind of madness of this. He said, when I watched George Floyd being murdered in America, all I could see was David Hume. And it's like, so your jaw drops at that stage while people in the audience are kind of like clapping their hands. So that seems to be kind of where we are. And I think if you link this general idea of what education is, I think you can then say, well, okay, let's look at school subjects, right, as the subjects we would understand them, geography, history, and so on. Because my understanding of school subjects is that, in a sense, they're the structured framework of human knowledge, broken down into blocks, if you like, building blocks. So you've got maths, English literature, history, geography, the sciences, the arts, and so on. And we've broken them down over centuries to be these bodies of knowledge. Now, if we are losing a sense of the potential in knowledge and the belief in knowledge to a certain extent, then that would suggest that subjects are going to break down. And we're already seeing, in fact, it was in Glasgow, but now here also this is a school in Edinburgh that's got rid of geography and replaced it with travel and tourism. And I think this is a possible direction that schools will start to go in, to sort of downgrade the significance of subject knowledge. And I think today, again, because of that, and this is where it gets confusing, because you start to think that these other agendas that come into education, that it's almost like this is the agenda, but actually it's like a lot of the talks and lectures I give, I try and explain to the students, actually the problem is that there is a black hole, right? i.e. there's an emptiness, right, which is then filled with crap, right? So it's not that universities want to use the market for everything. It's that they're empty, and the market is a mechanism that can be useful because there's a logic to it. So it looks like universities are being driven by the market, but they're not being driven by the market. They're being driven by a black hole at the heart of education because they don't know what it's for. Universities have no idea what a university is for. Schools and school educators, as far as I can see, have very little idea about what schools are for. Having said all that, there are a lot of good lecturers and a lot of good teachers, so there's a constant clash and tension. But the overriding framework, I think, is one where things are becoming more and more confused. On top of that, which I'll come to more towards the end, I'm constantly preoccupied with the way not just children, but students as well, are understood to be essentially vulnerable, right, which is a different dimension, but I'll come on to that. So I just thought I'd give you some personal examples. So this is where you cut this out of your recordings in the future. So I just thought I'd give you a feel, right, for university life in terms of some of the desperate dimensions of it. And of course, the real underpinning thing I think about exams is this thing about vulnerability, that students are seen as being vulnerable and and if something is too stressful, too difficult, because people are diverse. We've had a diverse student body. It's all the language. Exams, therefore, aren't inclusive, right? Because you have different types of learners. So it's kind of like the same language used for all sorts of different things around this thing. So with all of this going on, part of the thing I decided to do was to set up the Scottish Union for Education, because I could see the problems in university and I could see similar problems developing in schools. The school thing is kind of interesting in terms of, I'll give you a quick read, right? So this was done by, this was an anonymous article for us. So it's also, if you have any good stories that you can pass on about schools, universities, or other things, let us know. So the email address is on the flyer, right? So I'll just read this for you. I like the blurb, which says, "This article was written anonymously. It was done so to protect the author from the education authorities who should be promoting, not preventing, high standards in education." And this was an article we got from an English teacher. And he said, "The internet and streaming sites like Netflix are awash with documentaries about advanced civilizations which supposedly preceded our own. But you don't have to go back millennia to find better educated minds. A few decades will do. In a recent foray into a bookshop, I chanced upon an anthology for Scottish schools. Published in 1950, it would appear fourth, fifth and sixth year students in Scottish secondary schools were capable of conveniently studying up to 203 poems, imbuing them with a familiarity of Dunbar, Henryson, as well as Chaucer. The contemporary National 5 and higher students might study one poem, and that a damn sight simpler than Dunbar or Henryson. As a teacher, the picture that comes through of education in Scotland in the not too distant past bears almost no relation to the risible standards on display now. This sense of education as a collective responsibility, as something to be guarded and cherished, is gone. An English qualification is now considered a right, and since that is what it is, then it would be churlish to deny it to our young people." And he goes on to explain the levels. So you can get a pass with 37%, but you can get 20 to 25% just from copying stuff from the exam paper where it's got poems and stuff, and you just write down that text. So he says you can get 20 to 25% marks straight away from that. The folio, which counts as 30% of the mark, can include a 10-line poem or a 300-word biography of someone like Stephen Gerrard. And he says he's never seen anyone give less than 12 marks for this, right? So just based on that, and the 20 to 25 marks you get just from copying what's already on the exam script, you can get a pass in English. And he goes on to say, essentially, I'm seeing people leave with an A in higher English who are functionally illiterate, right? And I was just talking to, it was Richard, I was talking to Richard about, I think it must have been that, that you have to be teaching even Edinburgh University students how to write an essay in second year. And because I'm thinking, I'm in Aberdeen, I'm hoping that Edinburgh might be better. But apparently not so much better. Anyway, so that's a problem. And that's the sort of thing I'm very interested in, is to try and find evidence, because we want to be able to try and quantify what is actually happening in schools in terms of decline in standards. Because all my instincts tell me, and everything I kind of find suggests that this is the case. I mean, even my own son, when he was at school, so we're talking about 8-9 years ago, they changed it so that instead of him doing, I think it was 7 National 5 levels, they cut it down to 5. So even the number, so I did 9 subjects in a bog standard comprehensive, right, in the late 70s, 1980s, and he's now doing 5, right? That's not even at an O-level standard. And in a middle-class school in Broughty Ferry in Dundee, he did 5, right? Which is, I mean, even just at that level, it's just a significant depletion of basic knowledge. Anyway, on to the, I'll just say a little bit about the ethos, because I think there's a problem of the ethos that's been developed in schools around this idea of vulnerability, where children are seen through this kind of prism of being profoundly vulnerable. And you can see this, there's a really interesting document which is worth reading called Standards for Headship by the General Teaching Council. And it talks a lot about, it mentions social justice 17 times. It talks about sustainability, being inclusive, diverse, safe. It talks about protected characteristics and the experience of trauma. It says almost nothing at all about education. I don't think it mentions any subject knowledge, nothing to do with it. entirely around social justice. But I think the way to think about social justice is victim justice, right? Because it's not really about anything social. It's to do with categorizing groups of people as being victims that need to be protected. And then the school's new moral ethos, which is why I think it carries weight, is to protect these different types of children. So you get this in, if you look at the transgender argument, the strongest argument that they use is that if you don't validate, it leads to suicide, right? And so that's their trump card, which again is just like, that's this kind of a kick in the nuts for freedom of speech or thought, essentially. Excuse my crudity, but essentially that's what it is. You also find a lot of the discussions are about LGBT more generally, discussed in the context of bullying, right? And if you don't accept this, what are you saying? It's like, because we're just trying to educate people to be caring, right? And not to be bullying. So again, there's a kind of like, there's a stick being held above you to question any of the dimensions of these new forms of education. And I think it's what you have to bear in mind, I think, is once you have this ethos of vulnerability, how do you impose standards on children if you think that imposing standards is almost a form of abuse, right? And you have actually had teachers' unions arguing that exams are a form of child abuse. And so that's the latest proposal in terms of the new sort of baccalaureate, whatever it's called, the new diploma idea is whether we can get rid of exams. So that's for across all school subjects. So that's a potential development. So yeah, homophobic bullying is an issue. Racism in terms of bullying, now that's going to be incorporated, it already is, but will be incorporated into the hate crime framework, so that now the teachers will be encouraged to report incidents to the police. So a kid calls another kid, a racial name, something unpleasant, and so on. That should, if they're following best practice, be a police matter, right? And that's what's been instructed, especially in Edinburgh. Actually, all the schools in Edinburgh Council have got a draft of this, and there's a list of schools. One of the Royal High School, I think it is. Is there a Palermo or something like that? Anyway, there's at least 3 of these schools already in their handbook. They've got these policies in it about this should be a police matter. So essentially this caring approach, but it always ends up as a form of policing, right? Because once you start to see people as vulnerable, they're vulnerable from somebody, right? So it sounds caring, but it's actually profoundly authoritarian. So they seem progressive, but the dangers of criminalizing children is quite significant. Similarly, I think the stuff on misogyny is highly problematic, where girls are going to be taught about toxic masculinity, and boys are going to be educated about the dangers of their toxic masculinity. And again, you get this kind of harm prevention ethos developing in education. And I think all the time, it doesn't mean that you don't still have good teachers that are trying to teach, but if you go for a headship job and you're following all this stuff, you're going to get it. Right? If you tick all these boxes, but if you turn up and say, actually, I'm a brilliant historian, I've taught all of this, I've taught all of that, and so on, that will not be an interest. And you know this because you can just read the standard of headship document, and it tells you what they think is important, and it's social justice, inclusion, diversity, sustainability, protected characteristics, trauma awareness, and so on. So they're quite upfront about it. I mean, this is what's worrying, is that we need to get this message out, which is why I've produced our first leaflet. It's probably text too small, probably too wordy, but still I'm going to print thousands of these and send them out to anyone that wants them, if they want to hand them out, stick them on teachers' cars, and so on, without getting arrested. And my name's the only name on it, so it'll be me that gets arrested. But anyway, if people want some of these leaflets, get in touch and I can send them out to you. Yeah, so deeply worrying in terms of the values, worrying in terms of how people think about, how the educational elites think about you, right? So parents, grandparents, older people. And I do like that they have this, so this is the Human Rights Bill, which is trying to promote children's rights as a central part of Scottish law. And there's a nice little quote in it from somebody from the lived experience group, because only some people have lived experience, basically victims. If you don't categorize yourself as a victim, your lived experience, no one's interested in it. And it sounds like a joke, but you watch anyone who says lived experience and they're always claiming to be a victim. It's never someone who's done well, succeeded, overcame something, never, right? Lived experience is about victimhood and vulnerability. And it says this, it says, children's rights, the reason that children's rights are useful and necessary is because we need to unlearn the prejudices taught to us by older generations. Right? That's you guys, by the way, your basket of deplorables. Right? Unlearn the prejudices taught to us by, and this isn't a government document, unashamedly printing this bigoted, hate-filled diatribe against older generations. And this is not, no one's thinks of this, bats an eyelid, nothing, right? And I think it's worth bearing that in mind because I think it does connect to my first point, which is that actually part of the problem of older generations is you carry the past with you, right? And the past now is seen as sullied, right? Anything from the past, from history, anything that's not now is sullied. Right? So therefore you are necessarily sullied, right? It doesn't matter who you are, what you are part of the past, right? Especially if you're a grandparent. I mean, Jesus, you are a dinosaur in terms of your kind of attitudes and so on. Anyway, and so what we end up with is a really nice term, which is called socialization in reverse. So what's actually happening is schools become places to teach children to teach parents, right? So not schools are places where there's a sense of commonality, of adult solidarity between parents and teachers, but actually teachers and schools know that their job is to teach values to children that those children need to teach to their parents, right? And that's essentially it's an underpinning framework of this kind of approach to schools and children. So I'll whiz through this, right? So just to pursue this a little bit more, because I like this little thesis of schools basically are about harm reduction, right? So rather than about creating good, they're about limiting harm, right? So these are some examples I would give, as well as all the examples I've just given you about bullying, suicide, trauma, and so on. Geography is now moving towards being about sustainability education. So if you actually look at the geography curriculum, it's about sustainability, which is fine. It's not an issue of, is the environment not important? Is it important? Whatever. But the framework of the education is around the harms that humans do to the planet, right? In a very one-dimensional way. This is not a debate. This is just it's a relatively dogmatic framework. And whatever you think about it, I think if you're teaching geography, you should actually teach geography. I know it sounds mental, but I do think that history now, and I did check with my stepdaughter, history now, you get taught just about everything that's bleak about the past, right? So slavery is the top, that's top. Racism would be, connected to that. War, depravity, bigotry, whatever the subject is, Ku Klux Klan, she said she'd done, Jim Crow. So she'll know all about anything that's got blackness associated and white guilt. But she hasn't got a clue about Scotland, she's no idea about British history, no idea about European civilization. None of my students have heard of the Enlightenment or the Renaissance. In fact, today, this is how difficult it is to teach. And again, I know I'm annoying them when I say, don't worry about being ignorant, because I expect you to know nothing because you've been to Scottish schools. And they probably take that as an insult, but I don't mean it as an insult. But I then say, does anyone know what communism is? I mean, I was asking about, it was about democracy. And I was saying, do you know what places aren't democratic? So they mention they say China. And I say, do you know how China runs? Nobody knows how China runs. I say, you know it's a communist party? Not really. Russia, yeah, Putin, do you know how that works? No. I said, do you know what communism is? Not a clue, right? Not a clue what communism is, right? And I'm meant to be teaching them a kind of sociology course that's got a historical dimension. So all I can say is go on YouTube and type in what is communism, please, because I don't have the time. But I think I'm going to have to make the time. But again, it's part of the problem with the curriculum framework that the university's done, micro-credentials. I'll not go into it, but anyway, they've bastardized that as well. You can leave that in. So history is just a history of guilt. It's not balanced, it's not chronological. Maths, I'd love to see this actually happen, but now they're not arguing that maths needs to incorporate anti-racism. So every subject. And one of the arguments that they say maths is, I can't remember the exact language, but maths is associated with whiteness, right? And you're reading this and you're thinking, what? It's like, what, sort of triangles and squares and, you know, algorithms and you're trying to think, right? And then they say, oh, such and such and such and such haven't got the recognition they deserve. And I'm thinking, I don't know the name of any math, you know, who knows the names of mathematicians? You know what I mean? It's like, it's off the charts. Anyway, they want people to encourage discussions about maths. So examples like the Nazis used statistics as part of the Holocaust framework. I'm not joking. And slave owners, I think there was something to do with statistics about slave owners as well, right? So these are some of the examples. Astonishing stuff. English, in terms of the reading material, I think it's increasingly about recognition of diversity, right, rather than quality, right? So like which authors should you pick is more to do with whether they're diverse than, well, it's actually a quality text, which should be the only thing that really matters, right? And it's fine if you can, great black author, great, you know, purple author, no one cares, right? Just make it great, right? Make it great and make the kids read it, right? Which means you need a bit of discipline in schools as well. So I think just to conclude with that sort of scattergun of misery and despair, I think that the benefit is that there is a growing divide between what I would describe the new elites and people, right? And I think people have a much more common sense approach to what education should be. And I know this, although you know it's a slightly twisted one-sided group, but I did a talk a few years ago which kind of kicked me off on some of this stuff when they were doing demonstrations against the sex education curriculum, the inappropriate nature of sex education. And there was about, I don't know, maybe 90 people turned up in Glasgow, and I was given a little 5-minute talk. And they were there for the sex education stuff. And I didn't really talk about the sex education stuff, but I mentioned it. And in the end, at the end of it, I said, what schools should be about is maths, English, history, geography, the science and the arts. And as I said every word, I was getting a cheer, right? And the thing is, I knew I was going to get a cheer because people have got common sense about what the hell schools should be. And it's about knowledge, right? It is about the best that's been thought and said through history, and there's so much of it, and that is what needs to be passed on to the next generation, because if it's not, it gets lost, and unfortunately it gets filled with all this crap. And I think that is what most people in Scotland and in Britain do not want, this crap. Thank you.